Now on Mississippi Insight, state lawmakers have a deal in hand to overhaul Mississippi's taxes. The governor says he'll sign it. Magnolia Tribune's Russ Latino joins us to consider how we got to this point and what taxpayers have in store. Also,
when someone like Donald Trump is elected, who has a personal agenda, this is what you're faced with.
Congressman Bennie Thompson talks about federal layoffs, budget cuts, and presidential threats against him in his January 6th committee. That's all ahead this week on Mississippi Insight. I'm Byron Brown on broadcast and on podcast. Thank you for joining us for this March 23rd edition of Insight. Mississippi lawmakers have sent Governor Tate Reeves a historic tax reform bill. It eliminates the state income tax, reduces grocery sales tax, and increases the gas tax. However, the bill contains critical typographical errors that significantly accelerate tax cuts beyond what was originally intended. Despite concerns from experts and Democrats, the governor has pledged to sign the bill, dismissing the errors as issues that can be fixed later. One of the news writers watching this unfold since the very start of the 2025 session is Russ Latino. He is founder and CEO of MagnoliaTribune.com. Russ, welcome back to Insight.
Thanks for having me. It's March Madness Capital Edition, right?
There we go. Hey, tell me how significant this legislation is.
It's incredibly significant. So there are 9 states, Byron, that don't have an income tax. Those states do very well, by the way. I mean, states like Tennessee, Florida, and Texas that have seen real economic growth. But no state has ever fully eliminated an existing income tax. And so that puts Mississippi sort of at the forefront when it comes to this policy reform. I think what people need to understand is that this is not a rip the Band-Aid off type moment, though. We're not talking about full elimination of the income tax over the next year. This is a multi-year process. And to give some context for that, really what we're talking about is currently the income tax rate is a flat rate of 4.4%. It'll go to 3% by the year 2030. So you're talking about a gradual reduction. And then in the year 2031, based on revenue triggers, it will start to roll down more till you eventually get to that 0% rate. But it's a huge bill. I mean, it's a historic undertaking. And for those who believe that the tax on work is something that prevents people from being productive and prevents capital investment, it's probably a good day that it got passed.
Is this a perfect bill for the governor, or is he accepting this with any misgivings?
Look, I don't think there's any such thing as a perfect bill, right? The nature of having, 122 members in the House and 52 members in the Senate is lots of different people have ideas on how to do things, and you have a compromise process that very frequently doesn't result in the very best that it could be. But that's the nature of government. And so I think if you're looking at this from a does it tackle the goal of eliminating the income tax, the answer to that is yes. And then from there, you can start to talk about how you refine it in the future to make sure that it works.
Well, let's talk about the errors in the bill and what were they and why weren't they fixed before sending it to the governor?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the perception is that there was a mistake in the way that the Senate designed the revenue trigger so that, and this is something that would start in 2031, so that the revenue trigger would operate in a way where cuts would happen faster than what the Senate had anticipated when they were putting that provision together. It's important to note that I don't think Lieutenant Governor Delmer Hosemann or Senate Finance Chairman Josh Harkins have come out and said that, hey, this was a mistake. It seems that way from previous public statements. But the important thing to also understand is the reason why people aren't rushing to panic, at least if you're looking at Republican leadership in the House or the Republican Governor Tate Reeves, is that that provision does not start to take effect again until 2031. The legislature has 5 years in which to go back and refine this process to make sure that it works. And the great advantage of that is it will also have had 5 years of rolling down the rate from that 4.4% number I mentioned to 3%. So they'll get a really good sense of what it's doing to the revenue picture. They'll get a really good sense of what's happening in the economy. And in that span, have the opportunity to fix the problem.
And so as we were mentioning, the current 4% income tax will be trimmed by a 1/4 percentage point each year until 2030, as you're talking about. So any relief on income taxes may be a while in coming. So that's what we're talking about, right?
Yeah, so I mean, like I said, we're at 4.4 this year. We'll go to 4 next year. And then from there, we go down a 1/4 point all the way through 2030. What you're looking at on an annualized basis from where we are now to where we will be in 2030 is about a $647 million tax cut. So we're talking about a substantial amount of money being put back in the pockets of the people who earn them, the 1.2 million workers, the teachers and wrench turners across our state that help move the state forward are going to get that benefit. The other thing that I think you mentioned and alluded to is important is that it's not just the income tax that's part of this package. The package is actually quite large. And so the package seeks to address the sales tax on grocery by removing it or moving it down from 7 to 5%. That's about a $127 million estimated cut. It also seeks to address what has been a long-term complaint, I think, of the Mississippi Department of Transportation, and candidly, anybody that's driven down some of our roads and across some of our bridges, that we really need to focus on infrastructure investments by creating an additional direct stream of revenue. It does that by increasing the excise tax on fuel by 3 cents per gallon for 3 years, so 9 cents total. It also indexes that gas tax so that legislators don't have to come back and do this nonstop every time there's inflation, additional cost associated with putting together the roads and bridges. That looks like a net tax increase, or a tax increase of about $200 million. So if you're comparing these two things, you're looking at roughly $775 million of cuts and about $200 million of increases that are directed straight towards roads. That's a net tax cut, of over $500 million for the taxpayers of Mississippi. One of the important functions that I don't think has gotten a lot of attention is that one of the ways that you effectively, quote unquote, pay for this is that there's a spending cap in the bill as well. So the Senate put in a spending cap to say that they would only grow spending in government by 1.9% a year, to kind of restrain the growth of government and leave room to be able to reduce taxes in the future.
And speaking of those two taxes, the grocery tax and the gas tax, many people are looking forward to a lower grocery tax, but do you think they're going to be happy with trading off a lower grocery tax with an increase in gas taxes?
Yeah, look, I think the nature of this is that you always have some people who benefit more from a policy and benefit less from a policy. The question is ultimately what makes us most competitive as a state. And I think the thought process is that if we were to get to a point where there's the elimination of the income tax, which is a far larger number than the gas tax increase that's being discussed, the end result of that is that people have more money in their pocket to invest in their families, their businesses, and their communities, and that's how economies really grow. And so I think at some level, legislative leadership in the Senate, the House, and the governor's office deserves some credit for having what is a fairly big vision. The nature of taking on fairly big, there are some risk involved. But candidly, we're in a place as a state where if we want to compete, we've got to be willing to take risk when you see what's happening in states like Tennessee, Florida, and Texas.
Should Mississippians feel confident that the state can still fund essential services when we're about to lose $2.2 billion in revenue over 12 years?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that's really important to recognize is that over a 10-year span, we had 3 different very large tax cuts in the last 10 years, right? So we got rid of the 3% bracket, did away with the franchise tax. We got rid of what was the 4% bracket and then started to roll down the rate on everything else. And then in 2023, they did full and immediate expensing for business. So 3 very large tax cuts that have occurred in the last 10 years. And in each instance of those tax cuts, people who were opposed to them said, this is going to undermine the core functions of government. This is going to make it impossible for us to spend sufficient funds. What we saw instead was a 40% increase in tax revenue collected by the state of Mississippi over the last 10 years. We saw a state budget that went from $5.7 billion to over $7 billion. So government certainly hasn't been cut to the core based on the previous tax cuts. And I think it's really important to understand that we're not talking about taking $2.2 billion away from the government tomorrow. We're talking about incremental moves as the economy grows, as revenue grows, that you'd be able to reduce some of that and return some of that back to taxpayers. A better way to think of it, Byron, is to think about that you're giving a tax cut instead of increasing spending. You're not cutting spending.
What happens if tax cuts outpace economic growth? Is there a backup plan?
Yeah, I mean, certainly the way that I look at that is that there are two things that you can do. I mean, you can make hard decisions, right? You can look at it and say over a 5-year span, we increased the state budget by $1.4 billion, $1.5 billion. And maybe we could have done that a little bit slower, and maybe we can tighten our belt. The other option, candidly, and this is an option every single year, is the legislature can look at the conditions that they're facing and make decisions about whether to change policy. And so the fact that they passed this today doesn't make it impossible that they could change it tomorrow. That happens all the time with legislation. I think people should recognize that.
Let's not forget that the HB1 also makes adjustments to the public employee retirement system and lowers benefits for new members. How much of a difference will that make for the struggling PERS system?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think you saw the PERS board a couple of years ago say that there were two component pieces that they wanted to see to make that program more sustainable. One of those pieces was obviously additional funding, right? They wanted to increase the state's contribution to the PERS system. And there's been some of that that's happened candidly in a sort of piecemeal way. The other part of that you saw from the PERS board is that they wanted to create what they call Tier 5 for new employees that changes the benefit structure for new employees. I don't think that the Tier 5 that's been created hurts the current situation with PERS. It's not going to contribute to a larger unfunded liability. Currently, that's a big number. I don't know that it really helps in a dramatic way either. Certainly, I know the Senate was very committed to their plan. In a lot of ways, in my view, what they should have been thinking about is how do we modernize PERS for new employees, recognizing that for the vast majority of state employees who come in young, they're not ever going to vest because they move around from job to job. That's just the nature of that age group and the way that they're dealing with employment. And so at some level, I don't think it's going to have the benefit that some people think it's going to have, but it certainly doesn't hurt the current situation. And it's really, really important for people to understand this, Byron, that none of the existing PERS members are being moved into this tier, and no current retirees are being moved in this tier. So it's not going to affect their benefits at all.
Could this bill face legal or even legislative challenges?
I mean, I guess there's a universe in which anybody could sue for anything. I don't think so. I think the argument, if you're talking about PERS, is that there are some Supreme Court cases, candidly, that have been challenged in other states as well, where you can't change benefits once you've promised a benefit, right? So if somebody is already employed and they've been promised certain benefits, that you can't change it once they're in the system invested. That's obviously not the circumstance with Tier 5 because you're talking about new employees that hadn't previously been on other benefits. So I don't think that kind of lawsuit would be effective, at least against the PERS component. I don't know what a lawsuit would look like against the tax component if somebody would make some sort of argument about legislative intent. I'll tell you the way that courts look at this stuff is they look at the plain language on a bill, right? It's called the Four Corners Doctrine. And so they would look at the four corners of the document and say, is this language plain about what it means or not? I think the answer is that the language in the bill is very plain, and two chambers had an opportunity to vote on it. A governor is going to have an opportunity to sign it. And so I can't see any circumstance in which there's real legal challenge to either of the big components of the bill. Of course, there could be a legislative challenge in the sense that the legislature can propose a different piece of legislation next year. That's certainly part of the process.
Before this legislative session winds up, what's the next big thing you think will come out of it before it ends?
You know, this piece, it was a huge piece. Obviously, it's something that people, we talk about, it started in 2021. It really started in 2016, this conversation around the elimination of the income tax. So it's a 10-year process that kind of brought us to this moment. I think there's a certain degree of airletting after you pass anything this big. But I will tell you, one of the bills that is still raising a lot of questions is around pharmacy benefits managers. And I think there's an awful lot of confusion there about these pharmacy benefits managers who are really designed to try and hold down prices of drugs. A lot of big employers use them as part of their ERISA plans. There's a lot of conversation around how do we monitor these entities? How do we make sure that they're delivering a good product to customers? And then there's some conversation around how do we restrict them. I think that's dangerous if we don't understand the impact on big employers. and the potential impact of some of that legislation would be quite detrimental for big employers across Mississippi.
Russ Latino, always a pleasure talking with you and getting your insight. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for having me.
All right, and we'll be right back. Congressman Bennie Thompson is among a Democratic minority in Washington that is struggling to find an effective strategy for countering President Donald Trump's dramatic policy shifts, from budget and service cuts to federal layoffs and more. Thompson was vocal about his disdain for those policies. He spoke with constituents Tuesday at a town hall in Vicksburg.
Yeah, one of the reasons, as I said, that I came to Warren County is the fact that proportionately they have more federal employees than any other county I represent. And right now, they're the ones who are most under attack, given what's happening. I think they can have comfort that there is pushback, but the fact that they have been, over the last 2 months, basically put in an untenable position in terms of getting emails from strangers and things like that.
Right.
In terms of the work ethic, in terms of all those other things, it's a real problem.
Yeah, as you said, you came here because of all the government employees here. Is there anything you would want to say to them specifically?
Well, they have to, if they're in a union, they have to follow the leadership. The unions, AFG, GE, and others have been very out front and taken the government to court, and they're winning. But going to court takes time. But most of them will get the money back that they've lost and their job back. They should not have to go through this. When you have reductions in force, ordinarily, there's a plan. There was no plan. And so people are just kind of going from day to day as to whether I'll have a job or I won't. And so morale is at the lowest point that I've seen it with a lot of employees here. Productivity is being reduced because people don't know whether I'm here today, gone tomorrow. I have children in school, I have mortgages, I have a lot of things that normally, as a public employee, I wouldn't have to grapple with. That I'm grappling with it now, and I don't like it. And so I wanted to give some comfort to those employees and others that we are, in fact, pushing back, and we're winning. But it's on a day-to-day pushback basis, but we're winning. And that doesn't mean that they won't come, the Trump administration won't come with something else. But there are a group of us, primarily Democrats, who are not going to allow the Republican administration to treat government employees like that.
And tonight you also talked about how President Trump is trying to avoid the pardons that former President Joe Biden put on the committee. What are your thoughts on that? And I guess, does that have any merit?
Well, obviously it has no merit. The pardon power is vested in whoever's president. And President Biden did it, and it's done. But they are trying to unwrite history. And so much of what happened, people saw with their own eyes. So you can't say, oh, you dreamed it one night. No, you saw people breaking into the United States Capitol. You saw law enforcement being assaulted and all that. And all the Department of Justice did was prosecute those individuals. Now, a majority of those people who did their job don't have a job anymore because Donald Trump said that he shouldn't have pardoned them. Well, you prosecute crooks and criminals, and those people were both criminals and crooks. So, but when someone like Donald Trump is elected, who has a personal agenda, this is what you're faced with. So we have men and women who had careers in government service, doing a good job. He got rid of 5,000 FBI agents. I mean, my goodness, only because they investigated crimes that he didn't agree with. And now he's trying to go after each one of them. Rather than make America what it ought to be, he's on some retribution tour trying to get even. We're a better country than that. What people see Donald Trump is doing is not who we are as Americans. And the only way we can fix it is to stay engaged. Because if we tune out, that means the Donald Trumps of the world would have won. Thank you.
If you have comments or questions about today's show or suggestions for an interview or segment, just drop us a line. Email our producers. The address is news@WJTV.com. Big thanks to Russ Latino for joining us this week. We'll be back next weekend with more of the political and current affairs coverage that you demand. I'm Byron Brown from all of us here at 12 News. Make it a great weekend.